Hello everyone, and welcome back to Animation Pilgrimage, the show where Whitney and I take a look at every single theatrically released animated film in chronological order. I'm Tennille.
And I'm Whitney, and today we're taking a look at a big one. It's The Secret of NIMH by Don Bluth and Aurora from the USA.
Yep.
Well, people were waiting for this one, that's for sure.
Oh, I was waiting for this one.
Mm-hmm.
This is definitely a huge landmark film for us to cover, so as you can probably tell, this is going to be a bit of a longer review. I just want to start off by saying that seeing this movie in the context of everything else that was coming out at the time really makes a difference and really makes you notice how gorgeous this film is.
Oh, yes. This is very pretty. This is a very pretty film.
It's beautiful, and, you know, I think you can look at the history of this, so we'll get more into that later. But, you know, this was a film that wanted to try and get back to the golden age of Disney. And you can really, really feel that in the sense of scale, the environments, the background paintings. The colors are so rich. And obviously, even in just the character animation going on here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I have a lot of praise for this film. I'm also going to have several critiques, and it's going to be a long, bumpy ride for this one.
How about we start off with plot synopsis?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot that happens, but it can be summarized pretty quickly.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and start with that.
Yeah.
So Mrs. Brisby is a mouse, and she has a sick son. So she gets some medicine from a very smart mouse dude. I don't remember his name.
Mr. Ages.
Mr. Ages. But he has to, the son has to stay in bed, which is bad because it's moving time, aka the frost is coming, and the farmer is going to till the field, which he does. That being said, they are able to stop the tractor, so it gives them like a day or two maybe to figure out a solution.
Right.
So Mrs. Brisby goes and sees the great owl, which, you know, is pretty dangerous to do as a mouse because, you know, owls eat mice. But
the great owl is wise.
the great owl is wise and says she needs to get help from the rats of NIMH who live in the bush.
The rose bush.
The rose bush. So she does that. And the rats actually help her because of her late husband, Jonathan, who was actually one of them. I mean, he was a mouse, but he was also one of the NIMH people.
Right.
Which is all explained by Nicodemus, the leader of the rats of NIMH, and talks about how they were experimented upon by humans, and then they gained superhuman intelligence and stuff.
Not superhuman, they gained human intelligence.
Yes, they gained human intelligence, and it was a whole bunch of rats, and Jonathan, and Mr. Ages, and all the other mice died. He also gives her a magic necklace. This'll probably never be important, never whatsoever. They agree to help move her house, and she goes and drugs the cat, Dragon, but then she gets caught doing so by the humans, where she overhears that NIMH is coming in the morning because they've found their missing rats.
Right.
Anyways, they move the house, but there's some political intrigue going on with the rats. There's an evil rat that wants to take control and stay, where Nicodemus wants to move everybody away and stop stealing from the humans.
I was wondering when you were going to get to this point.
I mean, honestly, it's really not that important in the grand scheme of Mrs. Brisby's story.
Okay, so you're definitely on the bandwagon that this is a story about Mrs. Brisby.
Yeah.
And all the other stuff is just kind of like superfluous fluff.
I mean, to some extent, yes. Like, there's a grand universe and, like, political intrigue and stuff, but Mrs. Brisby doesn't care about any of that, and she's the main character, so I empathize with what she's struggling with, which is to get her son help so he can live.
That's really interesting, because I won't interrupt you. Well, I'll get into that later.
Anyways, evil rat cuts the line. The house comes crashing down. and it crushes Nicodemus, killing him. Then there's a sword fight with Chad Rat. Jeremy, whatever. He's good guy, hits on Mrs. Brisby. He kills the evil rat man. Jenner.
Yes, I made sure to write down characters' names. That way I could...
Okay, yes.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it was raining a lot, and the house sinks into the mud.
Terrifying!
Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. And important to note that all of Mrs. Brisby's children are inside the house. Not just her sick son, but her other 3 children as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we can touch on right now, is that Don Bluth, if you didn't know, very much so held to a philosophy in his films of you can basically show kids anything as long as there's a happy ending. Mm-hmm. You know, like within reason.
Yeah.
And for Don Bluth, within reason still means some pretty horrifying stuff. Rewatching this movie, I was like, shit, I forgot how scary this movie is.
It's scary. It's dark. It's intimidating.
Yeah, like there's a lot of this that like I'm not scared by it now, but just looking at the visuals, I could definitely see how a kid could watch this and be crying within the first 10 minutes or so. Because, like, the cat dragon is terrifying. Like, just the way everything is shot. And again, like, that sense of scale. The way the gray
tractor.
owl is projected. Yeah, the tractor tilling through the field. And because they use rotoscope, it's even scarier.
Because it's just kind shaded in black and stuff.
Yeah, and shaded in black and everything. That's terrifying.
The house sinking, the whole experimenting on the rat section. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of intimidating stuff. Anyways, we're almost to the end of the movie.
Yes.
So, anyways, the house sinks. But thankfully, Mrs. Brisby got that magic MacGuffin necklace, and touching it allows her to magically lift the house and put it in its place. The end. They're safe. They live happily ever after. Also, there is a comic relief crow that existed in this movie, and whenever they're on screen, the movie comes to a screeching halt.
Wait. No, the crow's name is Jeremy. Fuck. I messed this up. What's the other rat's name?
Well, I'll put it on screen now.
The other rat. His name is not Jeremy. We'll call him Chad Rat, because I don't remember what his name is.
I mean, he's the leader of the guard. He's a Chad.
Yeah.
He's general nice guy, dude, bro.
Nicodemus's chosen protege.
So yeah, that's like the plot synopsis. I don't feel like I really missed anything super important.
Another slightly terrifying scene that's, like, cool, but also is, like, just kind of unsettling, is when Mrs. Brisby is trapped in the bird cage, and she needs to, like, push the water trough out, and it, like, that's scary, right?
I mean, I guess it's intense.
It's intense.
Because she has to get out and warn people.
Right.
I wouldn't necessarily call it a scary scene.
Right. It's just another really intense scene.
That's the thing about this movie, is that you can call it intense and epic and grand for the fact that everyone is a mouse or a rat. And it all takes place on a farm. So, like, kudos on you, for Don Bluth, for making a movie about a farm interesting. Because, God, I hate farms.
All right. So
but that's a side tangent.
Listening to your summary is very...
Revealing?
A bit, yeah, actually. Because I think I'm more familiar with just this movie, this book.
I've never read the book.
And like, the stuff going on around this film.
Yeah, I mean, the book itself is called The Rats of NIMH, not The Secret of NIMH.
Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah. Let's talk about the book really quick and get that out of the way. So the book is Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, and it came out in 1971. The author is Robert C. O'Brien.
O'Brien.
That's just Brian?
Yeah.
But it's spelled with an E. That's wrong.
Robert C. O'Brien.
Okay, Robert C. O'Brien. I read this book probably between like middle school and high school-ish. So it's been a really long time since I've read it. I really did enjoy reading the book. I had already seen the movie when I read it. But they're different enough to kind of appreciate both on their own terms, I think. However, if you are familiar with the book, there's definitely some things about the movie that can really let you down. So some of the biggest changes between the book and the movie is, for one, the magic.
Yeah, there's no such thing as magic in the book, is there?
No, because the book is very much just a mixture of animal fantasy and sci-fi elements.
Yeah.
You have the animal fantasy part, which is very clear with Mrs. Frisbee and her struggles to save her child. And then when you get into the Rats of NIMH, that's where the sci-fi elements come in. And, you know, if Mrs. Frisbee is written very much so like Watership Down, then you get to the rats and suddenly it's kind of like a sci-fi novel.
Mm-hmm.
About like the experimentations that went on, that were done on the rats and like how terrible that was. And a lot of what the book is actually going for is it's asking you the moral question of like if animals achieved human sentience, how they are like, and they become aware of how humans perceive them.
Mm-hmm.
As thieves and like just creatures that steal,
mm-hmm.
then like, and they want to get away from that. They want to get away from those like stereotypes of themselves. But they've also built their society on getting energy and electricity from the humans, which is something that the movie touches on
Mm-hmm.
as the reason as to why the rats want to move to Thorn Valley.
Yeah, they just want to like take off and head out into the woods somewhere and live alone.
The rats want to move to Thorn Valley because they've discovered a way to create electricity for themselves.
Yeah, the movie doesn't really mention that part.
Yeah, so they want to become their own self-sufficient society. But, and in the book, Jenner's group has actually already left. So they're considered a group of, like, treacherous rats who still don't mind the idea of stealing. And they've left. And it's because they leave that the other rats are kind of discovered. Because in the middle of the night, they overhear that a group of rats was trying to steal, like, a motor from a store. And they ended up getting electrocuted and died. And so it's presumed that that was Jenner's group.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, NIMH, the scientists at NIMH, hear about this, and that's how they suspect that the other rats are at this farm.
Okay.
Yeah. It's interesting how the movie decides to instead bring all that conflict back in when it just kind of weighs the movie down.
Yeah.
With, like, this political intrigue stuff.
Well, we have to have some sort of climactic big fight at the end of the movie, so rat politics.
And then another big thing in the book is that the ending is quite a bit different. The rats are the ones who move Mrs. Frisbee's house.
Mm-hmm.
They save her. She does not have a magic amulet to save the children.
Yeah.
Or anything like that. So they make a pulley system. They do that, but because Mrs. Frisbee overheard about all of this stuff with Jenner's group and them coming to exterminate the rats, she's able to return their kindness and warn them that they should leave for Thorn Valley. So they destroy their home in the rose bush, make it look like an ordinary rat's nest, and 10 of them have to stay behind.
Oh.
So that the rats aren't all just gone, and the exterminators feel like they've got something done. The 10 who stay behind include Chad Rat, and they have a plan to hopefully get everybody out alive after the exterminator comes. But 2 of them end up not making it and dying, and I It's been a really long time since I read the book, but I think Chad Rat dies.
Okay.
And it's really sad. So yeah, like, the book is definitely more so focused on the morality and the intellectual questions that the rats bring up.
Mm-hmm.
If these kinds of experiments were to be done. Like, that is more so the focus of the book. So it was really interesting hearing you go through the summary of the movie and mostly focus on Mrs. Brisby because, yeah, the movie puts more focus on her, whereas before in the book, that's just more so a catalyst so that we can see what the rats are doing.
Mm-hmm. But no, this is a movie about Mrs. Brisby and her doing things.
Exactly why Don Bluth introduced the magic element into this film, because Bluth
so she
wanted
can have a big climactic event at the end herself.
Right. Bluth felt that it would undermine Mrs. Brisby's character arc if she wasn't the one to be able to save her children.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Like I said, I think you can get two very different experiences from watching the movie versus reading the book.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
But the book isn't the main thing we have to talk about today.
No, we need to talk about Don Bluth, the man.
The man, the myth, the legend.
I mean, he's still alive, so I wouldn't necessarily call him a myth or a legend yet.
I'd say he's already reached legend status.
Okay, yes, legendary, yes, not a myth.
Yeah, not a myth. He's very much so still alive. And,
he's very real.
Yeah, and still doing stuff. Although for a while there, he kind of felt like a myth because he did just kind of like disappear off the face of the earth for a really long time.
Mm-hmm. But within the last few years, he's
opened up his like own animation school and stuff like that. Good for him. So we've obviously talked about Don Bluth several times in Animation Pilgrimage, but I think it's really important to remember that Don Bluth was pretty high up in terms of what was going on in Disney while he worked there through
in the late
like
70s?
60s and 70s. He's been working there since Sleeping Beauty.
Wow, okay, yes, he's been there a long time.
Yeah, and he has like quite a bit of authority and stuff. Not so much that he is like
in charge of like
right, he's still not, Wooly Reitherman who gets to call the shots or any of the executives after Reitherman leaves or anything like that. But, he's an animation supervisor a lot of the time. He's a writer, a director in several of the films we've covered. And he actually did pitch NIMH to Disney.
Okay.
And wanted Disney to do it. And Disney rejected the idea when Bluth and his group of animators were working on Banjo the Woodpile Cat. He had also brought it up to Disney, hoping that Disney would distribute it.
Mm-hmm.
And Disney also shot it down, which sucked. Mm-hmm. It was probably one of the big reasons why he left.
Eventually would leave Disney.
Right. And obviously the biggest reasons for leaving the company is that he just felt that Disney was not doing what Disney could do best. And they were purposefully making watered down, not as good products as they used to do in the gold and silver ages.
Mm-hmm. He felt very disenfranchised by this studio he's been working for a good 10, 15, 20 years.
Well, imagine if you went to Disney while Sleeping Beauty was being made.
And then after that, you started making things like 101 Dalmatians and The Sword and the Stone.
And the Aristocats.
Was Sword and the Stone after?
Yes.
Okay, it's been a bit, I can't remember. It's like, yeah, suddenly making all these really boring movies.
Well, and this is a little thing that'll come back later, so put a pin in this. Speaking of Sword in the Stone,
Chanticleer.
Remember Sword in the Stone and Chanticleer?
They made Sword in the Stone instead of doing Chanticleer.
Right. And who was there at Disney at the time?
Don Bluth.
That's right.
Who goes on to make an adaptation of Chanticleer in like 10 years?
Yeah, give or take. I think it was made like in 95-ish. You can fact check me on that one. I'm not quite sure.
Sure. Here's the date when
Rockadoodle
comes out.
That'll be an interesting one to talk about.
Yeah, spoilers, he does a Chanticleer adaptation eventually.
Right. So, like, just from working at Disney, you can tell Don Bluth has a lot of ideas that, like, Disney passed up on. That Don Bluth was like, yo, this had potential. It's like, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it.
I'm going to make my own animation studio with good animation and saggy skin.
Blackjack and hookers.
Yeah, he puts a lot of blackjack and hookers in his movies.
He does.
That's not even a joke.
That's not even a joke. It's just true. Not specifically in this movie, though. Back to NIMH. Back to
NIMH.
All right. So anyway, in mid Fox and the Hound production, Don Bluth and a big old group of animators, I'm going to say it's like 20 or so animators, which is quite a lot for the studio at the time. They all leave, which sets Fox and the Hound back by a lot. You can hear about all that if you go to our Fox and the Hound review, but really messes up the production of that, and Disney is pretty pissed about it. So, Bluth now takes this Secret of NIMH pitch to, I forget, some production studio who hands out money for movies. Takes the pitch to them, and Bluth is given $5.7 million and 30 months to create The Secret of NIMH. 30 months.
That's pretty fast for movies back then, at that point in time.
Is really fast compared to Disney production.
Yeah, Disney usually makes a movie over the course of like 5 years or something, right? And they have like 2 movies going at a time, but like they stagger them back and forth.
Well, yeah, but they only... You're kind of confusing it with the 90s.
Okay.
Because in the 90s is when they really implement that system.
Okay.
So at this point in time, the animators and everybody working on the studio go from one project to the next.
Okay.
That's kind of the work schedule there. So yeah, they're given, a little under $6 million and 30 months. However, the budget for this film is actually closer to $6.5 million.
So there's like an extra million in there that...
Because Bluth and several of the other directors mortgage their houses to get more money.
Wow, okay.
To work on this film. And not only that, but Bluth and several of the directors were spending 100 hours a week in the last days of production working on this film to finish it.
I mean, they needed it to succeed.
Yeah, they needed it to succeed. They really put their all into this movie. And you can tell from watching it that there's just a lot of love and passion being put into this, and quite frankly, people's livelihoods. So when they mortgaged their houses, it was kind of agreed upon that hey, when we start getting money back, paying this off first is the first priority.
Okay, yes, that makes sense.
So that's good at least. I would never encourage anyone to get into a animation production crunch time like this. But this is also a time where they really were either going to make it or break it. They wanted to prove that they had something to show Disney. Show them up. And as a result...
It worked.
I mean, you can argue that this film saved Western animation.
Yeah, I would say so. I say that's pretty easy to
say. That really boils it down and makes it really black and white and everything. But, if you had to point to a movie to say this movie probably saved Western animation, probably this one.
Yeah, it wasn't Disney doing anything. They had to have a Disney animator leave and
compete with them
and show them up to get Disney to get their rear in gear again. And it's still gonna take them a bit to get going.
Oh yeah, we're not going to see the beginning of the Disney Renaissance until the late 80s.
89?
Well, 89 would be Little Mermaid, but you can kind of argue that the Disney Renaissance was already beginning to kind of kick off when, like, Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out.
Okay.
And even things like The Great Mouse Detective and Oliver and Company.
So closer to, like, 85, 86?
Late 80s is all I'm going to say.
Okay.
Late 80s.
Yeah.
So, all that being said...
How much did this movie make?
This movie wasn't marketed extremely well.
Okay.
So, at the box office, it made back $14.7 million.
Okay, it made its money back for sure.
It made its money back, and, you know, it doubled it. Like, that's not bad.
Hell, it almost tripled it.
Could have been better.
Mm-hmm.
Could have been better, for sure. And another important thing to point out is that around this time is when VHSs are starting to become a thing.
Oh.
So this movie actually made quite a bit more.
When they released it on VHS?
Exactly.
Oh.
However, if I'm remembering everything correctly, I think Bluth and his animation team didn't see as much of the VHS sales because of the way distribution rights work.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Don Bluth's story is going to be filled with a lot of passion. It's going to be filled with a lot of heartache.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be filled with a lot of getting screwed over by business. Because at the end of the day, I think Don Bluth had the will. I just don't necessarily think he had the way. And he ended up being screwed over by a lot of businessmen. And a lot of people kind of want to categorize Bluth as either a good guy or bad guy in, you know, all these situations, or, you know, like a legendary animator or a complete hack, a brilliant storyteller, or somebody who couldn't tell his way out of a shoebox. And I think Don Bluth sits very comfortably somewhere in the middle in a lot of these cases. He's just a guy who is trying his best to do something new, and for the record, in a way, he ended up doing it. He ended up making Disney be better. But he was really hoping that he was going to be like the next Walt Disney and build a huge empire. And oh my god, we will hear this story so many times throughout animation history. Is some white guy will think that he's the next Walt Disney.
Mm-hmm.
And then drama happens.
Yup.
Let's get into the film a little bit.
Okay.
Because we've praised this film quite a bit, but now I have to talk about some of my problems with this movie.
Yeah, go for it.
So, this is definitely a movie where I think it's gorgeous. I actually think a lot of the characters are really likable. Even Jeremy the Crow, while he's a tangent oftentimes, and his point is to be a bit irritating, I do find him charming mostly.
Yeah, it's just, he adds literally nothing to the plot of the movie. He does not help.
Yeah.
In any way. He actively makes situations worse more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm saying, like, whenever he's on screen, the plot comes to a screeching halt.
Yeah.
Especially in the end of the movie, he shows up, does a silly goof. All the other characters stop and say, "Good job, Jeremy."
Good job,
And then
Jeremy.
he walks off screen and the actual plot continues. He literally does nothing to help.
I know. This is where I have to say that, like, this movie has story problems. Like, the pacing has that problem that a lot of the 70s era Disney animated movies have, or just a lot of the movies that we've watched in general over the past decade, of like, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. There's not a great flow from set piece to set piece.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that I get where Don Bluth is going with the magical elements of this film, but it just adds too much to this movie. It's already a lot. There's a lot of characters to keep track of.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of plots to keep track of. It's already being an animal fantasy and a sci-fi, and now you're adding, like, high fantasy elements into this as well.
Mm-hmm. pure of heart people can do magical things with this MacGuffin item.
Right, and it just does not have anything to do with the whole science aspect of the movie, like with the rats being experimented on. Like, why is Nicodemus an old wizard man? Nicodemus in the books is just the leader of the rats. Mm-hmm. He's just a guy.
He's just another guy.
Yeah, but in here, Nicodemus is like
Magic
Gandalf.
wizard with electric scrying orb thing.
Right, he's just pure magic. Like, he can just, like, move his finger and write words in a book. Like, he's just a magic guy. And, like, that just doesn't fit with what's being presented as, like, the core of the film. It's weird. I think Bluth is onto something by saying, like, Mrs. Frisbee Brisbee, that's another thing to bring up, is that they had to change her name from Frisbee to Brisbee so that they wouldn't get in copyright struggles with the company that makes Frisbees. Anyway, so her name is Brisbee in the movie. But making the story about Mrs. Brisbee is a smarter idea for the type of audience they were going for. Having her have, like, the strength of heart or whatever, like, that's a perfect moral for an early 80s film. Totally makes sense why they would go that direction. It's just, like, the magic element doesn't make sense here. Mm-hmm. I think there's probably some other way they could have focused the story more on Mrs. Brisbee while not doing the magic stuff. And I feel like I know why they did the magic stuff, because the magic stuff looks cool in animation, and they wanted to make a cool looking animated movie.
Yes.
So...
lots of sparkles and flashes and lights.
Right.
Because, yeah, they definitely did a lot with the effects animation in this film.
The effects animation in this film is gorgeous. Like, the cobwebs on the owl and shit. Oh my god. And just, like, all the sparkles and every... This movie's gorgeous. But another critique is that, like, basically all the changes they made from the book, even setting aside my feelings of, like, well, it's changes from the book, that's dumb, or whatever. I don't think the changes from the book are bad because they're not what the book did. I just think they're kind of poor changes. Mm-hmm. Like, making Jenner the obvious bad guy twirling his mustache in the background. It's just kind of not that interesting.
Mm-hmm. He's such generic
and super
bad
obvious.
Guy. Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with a conflict as real and personal as Timmy has pneumonia and he can't move for 2 weeks, but if we don't, our house is literally going to get, like, bulldozed and everyone in it will die.
Yeah.
Like, that's a very real, personal threat. And then you have mustache-twirling Jenner over here.
No, I want to stay here and keep stealing from the humans. Ho ho!
Yeah, exactly. It's just... the way the book handles it is so much more clever. And also, like, I think they could have found a different thing for Jenner to do, or another way to fix this story issue.
Mm-hmm. I'll drop the house on his head, and that will teach that old Nicodemus.
Literally, Jenner's like, I'll just drop an anvil on the old man's head.
That's not what he sounds like at all, but it's just like, that's
the vibe. That's the vibe. And then he has, like, a sidekick
who's like,
betrays
I don't think this is a great idea.
Right. And that's trying to add some depth to this storyline, but like, it's not enough. It's not enough, because you have one guy who's like, let's commit a murder. And the other guy's like, I don't know, Jenner, I kind of think murder is bad. And, like, that's the nuance.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
For sure.
So this is definitely a movie that I feel has a lot of strengths. Its weaknesses are definitely still obvious, though. Mm-hmm. It made a huge impact on the animation industry that we're not going to see right away. This isn't like a Fritz the Cat moment where it's like, oh, suddenly...
everyone and their dad is trying to emulate this.
Right. This is going to be a slow burn. to get to the change. But that doesn't mean that this film wasn't still super impactful. And the films that Don Bluth will be working on to come, they all build up to what's going to be happening.
I would absolutely say Don Bluth's movies that he makes here in the 80s specifically are probably his best work. And as a collective influence animation more than any individual film has in quite a while.
Right. And the biggest problem with, like, this film, the story structure and the pacing and everything, is something that Disney is going to address through the input of Howard Ashman. And that's where Don Bluth just gets totally left behind. Is when Disney will hit their stride, it's because of Howard Ashman's thought into the story structure and pacing and making it feel more like how a Broadway musical is paced out and everything like that. And that's kind of what Bluth's films are missing. It's just that cohesive story guide to keep this all together. But yeah.
Well, either way, definitely watch this movie if you've not. Or if you haven't watched it in a really long time, like me. I genuinely think this is the first time I've watched this movie in, I would say, 20 years.
Yeah?
Honestly, I
don't think you've watched this since you were a kid.
Yeah, I watched this movie once, maybe twice when I was a very young kid. And then when I was a teenager, I watched 1 or 2 reviews on it because...
Reviews were the thing.
Reviews were the thing that were popular. But I personally had only watched this movie once or twice before we watched it for this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the last time I watched it was in college, which, is definitely sooner than when you watched it, but that's still
closer to
10 years ago. Yeah, exactly. So... yeah, it had been a while since I'd seen it, and especially because of Animation Pilgrimage, we get the context of everything that came before, and seeing this again. I can't emphasize enough how obvious it is that, these backgrounds and these environments are so painstakingly detailed to remind you of, the golden ages of animation. Bambi and Pinocchio. They're gorgeous, and they are very specifically going for that feeling, and they're doing a fantastic job at it.
Absolutely.
Great film. Rewatch it if you haven't. And if you've read the book, let me know, because I love hearing about people who've read the book. How do you feel about the book compared to the movie?
Yeah. And then, join us back here next time as we go back to Japan.
Oh, boy.
And we're going to be here for 7 or 8 films.
Oh, God.
But then we're pretty much done with Japan for this year. But, we're going to be in Japan for a really long time.
Oh, my God.
Anyways, join us back here for Space Adventure Cobra, the movie, from Tokyo Movie Shinsa.
Awesome. See you then.